Hi everybody, welcome back. This is our last lecture of Unit 1. This one we're talking about treaties and other kinds of agreements either overseen by, made through, or coordinated with, in a sense, the United Nations. The UN is founded by charter, which has the force of a treaty. And what I really want to talk to you about is the different levels of agreements so you understand the different kinds of responsibilities states have and or the UN has when one of these agreements is entered into force. So there's tons of different things that we could look at. There's pacts and there's conventions and there's resolutions and there's declarations and there's treaties and there's charters and conventions and a whole bunch of other things, protocols and addendums and the like. They have different weights. They carry different weights. And when you talk about them having different weights, it really implies a different sort of exchange of sovereignty for benefits. Some of them imply no exchange of sovereignty for benefits because they are not binding in any way. Others have the force of international law. But even when they have the force of international law, you should keep in mind that those govern things that happen internationally between states and not domestically within a state. So lots of stuff to talk about as we go through here, and hopefully we can clarify what you read, what kind of agreement you read about as to what's going on. So, let's start with UN Article 102 of the UN Charter. So this is one of those things that you read about in the assignment for this unit. It's an important carryover from the League of Nations. If you recall back in the history of what led to World War I, actually, you may not recall it because I don't think we covered it in this class, but if you had it before or maybe it's new to you, one of the things that made it such a fast spreading war was a series of secret treaties that were entered into by different states where one state promised another that if it was attacked, that they would come to their aid. And so many of these existed that a war between two countries became a war between 4, 6, 8, 10, and pretty soon you had World War. So there was a commitment that treaties should be open, that once they were agreed upon, not open in terms of open for anyone to sign necessarily, but open in terms of open to the world to read and see. So the League of Nations tried to do something really quite strong in its exchange for sovereignty for benefit. It said, if you look here in their Article 18, that unless it was registered with the UN, it didn't even count as a treaty, that they wouldn't recognize it in any way. But that didn't really work out, and states didn't like that precedent. So when you're renegotiating what treaty making would look like in regards to the United Nations and the UN treaty series, Article 102, if you read through that, you can pause and read both of these things. It just says you have to lodge it with the UN, that there will be a treaty collection where it will be kept, and that if it's not lodged, then you couldn't cite it as precedence or justification for what you did. But it didn't say it wasn't binding or it didn't count, because that was silly. So it's not just charters in the UNTS. All kinds of international agreements are filed here. There's more now than 158,000 of them. Now, you and I, anybody actually, can register with the UN Treaty Collection to get text or email updates. Anytime there's a change made to a treaty, there's a new treaty signed, there's a new signatory or a new extension or whatever to a treaty, you can get those announcements. So they've gone so far to make sure it's open to the world that you and I, as individuals, not just states, could be kept apprised of what's going on. So that's an important component here to our treaty mechanisms. And actually, in the treaty series, there's more than just treaties. There's some non-binding agreements and other sorts of things as well. So that means that even if it's just a bilateral treaty between two states, say the U.S. and Canada, who are soon to be negotiating the Columbia River Treaty, renegotiating the Columbia River Treaty, when it's finalized, that will go to the UN Treaty Collection as we comply with that. Treaty making, though, is interesting. So in international treaties, you consent to be bound by. That's the concept, that there's not a treaty entered into where non-states parties are required to obey. You have to consent to be bound by it. So this is when we talk about that exchange for sovereignty over benefits. Just because a treaty happens, and it may be international, and say the global community is going to do X, Y, and Z, you're not bound by it unless you choose to be. Now, different kinds of agreements involve different parts of the U.S. government, and they have different levels of sovereignty for benefits. So let's start with this big image here on the left, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So that's early Clinton Gore and Clinton's first term, Bill Clinton's first term of office, 1993. It was a framework convention that was non-binding. It was a group of states, all the states that were coming together to say what they were going to do to help mitigate greenhouse gas emissions, but it's not binding. So the UNFCCC is a thing that the executive branch of the United States could engage in a non-binding fashion and then try and shape policies domestically as they see fit. The Kyoto Protocol is related to the UNFCCC. It was an attempt, a protocol to the convention that was going to be binding. Okay, so the United States signed the Kyoto Protocol. A signatory to an international agreement like this, signatory actually represents the agreement of the executive branch of the country in question. But in our governmental system, the executive branch cannot bind us to an international treaty. They can only indicate their intent to join the treaty. So a lot of people became frustrated as the United States never enacted the stuff from the Kyoto Protocol, and they didn't do it because the legislative branch never ratified the signature. So the executive branch goes out and negotiates, and signs. Sometimes doesn't sign. Sometimes we just negotiate and try and get our position in there, but we don't sign a treaty. So in the Kyoto Protocol's context, we did sign the treaty. We signed the Kyoto Protocol. It was never even introduced to the U.S. Senate because it was clear that it wasn't going to go through. In fact, I think one of the straw polls found that it would have been 95 no and 5 abstentions, that there was no one supportive of binding the United States to that. So a signature does not indicate your consent to be bound by. A ratification does. Now, there's a few other ways you can go about that if it's not immediate. I've got a optional reading for you. It's just 2 pages. It's here in this unit. It's about international law and the other ways that you might join. But binding ourselves is complicated because even if the Senate binds us to it, then the judicial branch can investigate it to see if it is in keeping with the U.S. Constitution. We cannot join something that supersedes the Constitution. We consider our Constitution to be the supreme law that we follow. That's not always the case in other countries where they can have things that are above their Constitution. We cannot. So all 3 branches of government have to weigh in and decide whether it goes through. Now, treaties are eternal. What I mean by that is that successor states, if one state has agreed to be bound, the successor state is also bound. So it could be a successor government or a brand new state. For example, Russia, the Russian Federation today, inherited all the responsibilities of the Soviet Union. It got its perks as well. So, for example, that spot on the Security Council that has a permanent seat, Russia got that. But they also got anything that the Soviet Union had agreed to, the Russians are also bound to. So if it was signed and ratified, it's there. So that's a successor state, and in other cases you have successor governments. So you remember we talked about the non-self-governing territories in an earlier conversation this unit. Gibraltar is pictured here. It's geographically appended to Spain. It belongs to the United Kingdom, and it got there in the Treaty of Utrecht, which ended one of the wars for Spanish succession. In this case, this was an external war, not just an internal war, where the Dutch and the British beat the Spanish forces. And in the treaty, the British got Gibraltar in the settlement. So Gibraltar then became a UK possession. And when that happened, Spain lost that, even though it's geographically appended, it's UK's territory. But there was a clause added to the treaty that said that if the UK ever tired of it for whatever reason, that the territory had to be offered back to Spain for first refusal. In other words, they couldn't turn around and sell it to the Portuguese or sell it to the Moroccans, but if they wanted to do that, they could ask Spain. If Spain said, yeah, no problem, go ahead and sell it to the Moroccans, then they could. But if they didn't, then you can't do anything with the territory. And in this case, it's a non-self-governing territory because the people in Gibraltar are considered not to have been allowed to self-determine. Gibraltar itself has a constitution that governs it. That's under the UK, but It recognizes the people as Gibraltarians as a distinct nationality, and the UK would be happy to let Gibraltar become independent. Spain is not happy for Gibraltar to become independent. Spain wants Gibraltar. So that NSGT context is stuck in Gibraltar because of a treaty that is more than 300 years old, because the treaty is binding on the successive governments in both the UK and in Spain. So that's really shows you that that stuff lasts a long, long time. Now, not everything the UN does or that states do are treaty making. Sometimes they are resolutions and sometimes they are declarations. These tend, because there are some exceptions, tend to be non-binding. Think of it this way. Most of us in the United States had lots of different history, U.S. history over the years. The Declaration of Independence on July 4, 1776 was really an aspirational statement. We still had to fight the war. It wasn't as if the declaration happened and the British said, oh, okay, I see you've declared you're independent, therefore we're done. We'll just pack our bags and go. No, we still had several years of fighting left to make the declaration active. On the same token, you might think of your own New Year's resolutions where you resolve to do something, but there's nothing binding. It's not like somebody comes and said, hey, you said you're going to exercise every day and you're not exercising every day. You're in trouble. They're not. They are declarations, and resolutions are statements of intent. Unless the resolution comes to the Security Council, it's non-binding. Now, they have a peculiar flow and a peculiar language. And I'm going to have you read one of these. It's a famous Security Council resolution about involving women in peacekeeping. It was binding because it was passed under the right part of the UN Charter, Chapter 7, about the Security Council. But most resolutions aren't. For example, this is one from 2012. It's about the International Day of Happiness. It's a statement of intent. It's not like you go around on the International Day of Happiness. If your country is not happy, then you're in trouble because you didn't do something right. It's a statement of intent. The UN Declaration on Human Rights, some people argue, has the weight of law, but it does not. It was a non-binding. It was never ratified by the U.S. Senate. So it's aspirational. And this is Eleanor Roosevelt, who actually came to the University of Idaho in the early 1940s to speak when she was envisioning what this would look like later. There's a great picture of her on the first floor of the admin building across from the president's the university president's office suite, which you should swing by sometime. Now, just because these things are not binding doesn't mean they don't have great importance and great effect. They tend to shape national policies, UN directions. So you saw in that last unit, we got more than 44,000 employees out there, plus local offices. So if you have a resolution that says the organization is going to do something, then that follows through the organization itself. But it also channels then lots of money and effort in addition to that of the UN into shaping what comes next. So what you have here is an image of the global goals for sustainable development called the Sustainable Development Goals. There are 17 of these that will be active. They became active at the end of 2015. They're active through 2030. And those are things that national governments, non-governmental organizations, corporations, the UN itself are striving to meet, and they're channeling hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars over these 15 years to achieving these goals. And for example, when the U.S. Agency for International Development organizes its annual plan of action, that's the U.S. agency that goes out to help develop things. That's a U.S. agency. No one can control what it does. It's to our priorities and where we go, but we will align them with these. So even though things come out of resolutions and declarations that are non-binding, it tends to shape time, money, effort into achieving them, even if it's not binding. It's just that no one can come to you and say, you promised, and you're not following through. Now, there's a lot more besides this, where you would have to look and say, look at how it all fits together. What I mean is there are ways out of some treaties. There are clauses that sunset treaties, and there are times when resolutions sort of pass out of activity. like a commitment to a resolution is not considered binding on successor states. So you couldn't do that the way you hold one to another over time. But it was worth your time to understand the level of commitment being made in each of the documents that you read.